read through our speaker bios. I know this will be a little bit long because we do have 4 panelists, and then I'll be reading through the presentation description as well. So without further ado, Madeline Roberts is the Washburn County Natural Resources Extension Educator. She has worked in several natural resources areas, including wildlife, water quality, aquatic invasive species, wetland ecology, and fisheries. Madeline has a Master of Science in Fisheries and Wetland Ecology. Our next panelist is Eric. In his position as Conservation Planner for the Polk County Land and Water Resources Department, Eric Wojchik has been involved in countless conservation and resource protection initiatives. Eric has been involved in the Farmer-Led Watershed Protection Initiative since it began in Northwest Wisconsin in 2012. His involvement has ranged from the initial planning of the program and recruitment of participants to the actual work in the field and expansion of the program. And then we have Timm Johnson. Timm Johnson is a retired dairy farmer that still raises corn, soybeans, and rye. The soybeans are non-GMO that are food grade with identity preserved for tofu in the Pacific Rim. The beans are processed in bloomer, trucked to Minneapolis, via rail to Seattle, and then container shipped to Japan or South Korea. It's possible to track every step of the process back to pictures of the crop in the field. The rye is marketed for cover crop seeding. Timm has extensive involvement in local, regional, state, and national organizations. Timm retired in April 2019 from 36 years on the Osceola School Board with 34 as president, excuse me. And then our last panelist is Bill. Bill Hogseth is a 6th-generation native of Dunn County. Bill has 15 years of experience working in the field of conservation and wildlife biology with West Wisconsin Land Trust and the Wisconsin DNR. Currently, he is the watershed coordinator for the Wisconsin Farmers Union, where he works directly with farmers to support the adoption of conservation agriculture practices. And I'm just going to read the presentation title, just in case you still aren't sure if you're in the right room. But so today, come learn about a grassroots effort by farmers to protect and improve water quality. Farmer-led watershed councils are getting started around the state as an effort to help farmers adopt practices that protect water quality. Horse Creek Farmer-Led Watershed Council in Polk County and Shell Lake Yellow River Farmer-Led Watershed Council in Burnett and Washburn County will be represented on this panel to discuss work and answer questions. Meet your upstream neighbors and learn how they are helping to solve water quality issues.
Thank you, Caitlin. This is Eric here. Thank you for the introduction, and I think we'll get started with the presentation. Farmer-led watershed councils where land and water meet. I think to start off, it would be helpful to share some background on how the Farmer-led Watershed Council initiative started in Northwest Wisconsin. And really, it was a product of a 9 key element planning process and the total maximum daily load planning process for Lake St. Croix. And towards the end of 2011, when those planning processes were taking place, civic engagement was identified as a priority throughout that process. And to demonstrate the potential of citizen engagement, the soil and water conservation efforts, farm visitors from Iowa and Iowa State University Extension visited our St. Croix implementation team meeting. Chad Ingalls from Iowa Extension at the time and Jeff Pape, one of Hewitt Creek's producers, shared their story and their model for farmer-led councils and their engagement and soil health initiatives and water quality initiatives. Their presentation was really inspiring, and the project team at that time took that information and 4 county land conservation departments, Wisconsin DNR, UW Extension, all collaborated to develop a similar program and eventually secured funding in 2012. The funding that was secured was through Wisconsin DNR Lake Protection Grants and additionally the Mississippi River Program through the McKnight Foundation. Since this time, statewide interest has increased, and the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection has allocated funding to promote development of more watershed councils. Next slide, please. Here is an illustration of the pilot councils that were started under that very first initiative here in Northwest Wisconsin, and it involved 4 watersheds. The Horse Creek Watershed here in Polk County, the Hay River Watershed in southern Barron and northern Dunn County, the Dry Run Creek Watershed in St. Croix County, and the South Kinney Watershed in Pierce County. Next, please. As of 2020, there are a total of 27 groups that are funded with DADCAP grants, producer-led watershed protection grants to be exact, and there's been $750,000 allocated towards this effort statewide. I believe there's been 31 total farmer-led watershed councils funded through DADCAP's programming since its inception. And this gives you an idea of where the 2 watersheds are located that will be the focus of today's presentation. So we'll move next into the Horse Creek Watershed Council and who we are. And I say we because you know, our agency staff, land and water staff, are just as much a part of it as our farmers and our coordinator. It's a wonderful partnership, and we're all in it together, so to speak. Our Watershed Council is a diverse group of agriculture producers with different operations and common goals. They all care deeply about the future of agriculture and the productivity of our lands for future generations. Those involved right now, we have 7 active Farmer Council members. We have 2 Polk County Land and Water Resource Department staff, and 1 Wisconsin Farmers Union coordinator, Bill, who's with us today, and Timm Johnson with us today as well as one of those active Farmer Council members. So thank you both for attending today. Our project area includes a total of about 42,690 acres. And we focus on the Horse Creek Watershed, which makes up 38,000 of that 42,000 acres. And the Squaw Lake Watershed was a new addition 3-4 years ago, and a small watershed, but many of our producers involved in this watershed effort own and operate land within that watershed, so it made sense to include that watershed. Next, I'll move into the mission, and this gives you a good picture of the mission of our group, and I'll read it here. The Horse Creek Area Watershed Council is a voluntary, producer-led environmental management program. Our mission is to inspire producers to adopt best management practices dedicated to protecting water quality and improving soil health. We have a number of goals, and these are just to list a few, really. But one of the goals is to proactively address resource concerns or issues to prevent further regulation. The next is increase farmer engagement in soil health practices. The goal was always to expand to additional watersheds, and I think this group has done it locally and inspired many of the watershed councils that have been developed throughout the state, which is something that I think this group should be very proud of, their influence in others. Soil health improvement has also been a goal, and soil health improvement directly relates to water quality improvement. If we protect soil health. We improve infiltration, we keep nutrients within the field, and ultimately reduce erosion and improve water quality. So we see soil health improvement as the foundation to improving water quality. Widespread cover crop adoption is also a goal. There again, one of those pieces of soil health, and ultimately a best management practice that improves water quality. And then the last one listed here is basically providing a mentorship opportunity for their peers in conservation practices. Our farmers, as you see in the picture here, they're able to share equipment, ideas, and farm practice ideas that work, that improve soil health, improve water quality, and share that with their peers. I've always thought that if we know a little more about something that interests us, we're more apt to adopt or practice it ourselves. So we think the mentorship program within this initiative is very helpful and has made great gains in the success of our program. I think the next slide moves into a description on the Shell Lake and Yellow River Watershed Council. So I'll pass the ball to Madeline, and she can move forward with a few slides detailing their watershed council.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you and Tim for all of your work that has really laid the foundation and inspired us to start the council in Shell Lake and Yellow River. We're a pretty young council. We just got started last year, so we're in year 2 of getting those Department of Agriculture grant funds. And part of what attracted myself, County Land and Water staff, and the Northwest Grazers Network to collaborate and start a council in our area is what Eric described as not only the success that they've had, but also that we're putting farmers in a leadership role. A lot of our farmers in our area have had success with some of these practices. So let them really give them the support they need to be leaders to the farming community in sharing those as mentors, and they know often the best way to help other farmers get started in these practices. So our council is a diverse group of farmers, including dairy, crop, and grass-fed cattle and bison operations. We have 9 active farmer council members and a support team, which includes County Land and Water staff, extension educators like myself, NRCS, the Northwest Wisconsin Grazers Network, and Wisconsin DNR staff. And we're very fortunate to have such a large support team of people who are interested in supporting our farmers and to work together as a team and do high quality education and outreach around this work. Next slide, please. So you can see here the Shell Lake Yellow River watershed. If you remember back to the previous slide, we're northeast of where the Horse Creek watershed is, and we're kind of on that northern boundary of where you would see significant agriculture in our landscape in a watershed. North of us, it really gets to be more dominated by forest. So when we were looking at, back to the previous slide, please. When we were looking at a watershed to choose, we were attracted to the Shell Lake Yellow River watershed because of the high quality of water resources that are there. So you'll see Shell Lake labeled, it's that heart-shaped lake on the lower part of the watershed. That is an outstanding resource water listed by the DNR, which is a special designation denoting its high quality. It also has a really good smallmouth bass and walleye fishery. This watershed also captures the headwaters of the Yellow River. So if you see Spooner Lake, which is just to the right of the city of Spooner, there's an outflow there that is essentially the start of the Yellow River. It flows through the city of Spooner and then zigzags around on Highway 70, flowing into Burnett County and eventually going into Yellow Lake and then into the St. Croix River. This Yellow River system has a thriving lake sturgeon population. It's one of 6 in the nation that has 1,000 lake sturgeon in the population. And it's pretty significant considering that lake sturgeon's being considered to put on the Endangered Species Act as a threatened species. So we're very fortunate to have that population up in the Northwest area, and certainly is a motivator to protecting the high quality waters that we have here. There's also a number of trout streams and other outstanding resource streams in this watershed. So lots of high quality water that we want to protect, not only with farm practices, but also with other landowner practices as well. But this kind of gives us a foundation to start the work, at least in the agricultural community. One of the things we, part of the considerations for picking such a big watershed compared to the Horse Creek one is that our agricultural lands have fewer farmers actually operating on them. So you can go to the next slide. Our council ended up voting to add watersheds, these 3 smaller watersheds that actually feed to the Upper Clam River this spring, because our farmers were, like Eric's and Tim, were operating on that boundary where some fields were in, some were out, even neighbors were not qualifying for some of the incentive programs. That's part of the Department of Agriculture's grant requirements, is that money for incentive programs are spent within the watershed. So we wanted to make sure that we were opening up our council and its work to as many farmers in our area as possible. And the Upper Clam River is actually a high quality trout system as well, if not the best in our area. So you can see the acreage there too, that Shell Lake is 110,000. And with our new additional creek watersheds, we've opened up 75,000 acres. Next slide, please. So the Shell Lake Yellow River Farmer-Led Watershed Council's mission is to work as a nonprofit organization to improve the soil health and water quality through outreach, education, and conservation practices that improve sustainable agriculture. Next slide. So all councils offer a variety of learning opportunities to bring pertinent information to the local agricultural community. We've kind of touched on these a little bit, but these include things like field days where farmers can learn on-site how these practices work on a farm or in a field and the benefits that the farmers see who are able to do these successfully. We also do demonstrations and research plots. Both Horse Creek and Shell Lake Yellow River have long-term research plots that we're doing. In our Northwest area, we have challenges from a farmer's perspective of a short growing season. So think about the months that we have that are summer and warm, and it's pretty limited. So practices even that work in Illinois or Iowa have to be adjusted because we have less wiggle room for growing things like cover crops. We're also challenged with our cold climate, and every farmer has different soil types that have different challenges with it as well. So we want to try and research what's going to work best to address those challenges. We also promote conservation practices through our incentive programs. So part of the council's work is to provide incentives for farmers to try these practices. Just like anyone who's trying something new, you're not always going to be great at it the first time, and there can be a learning curve with adopting these conservation practices. The incentive program is meant to help lower some of that risk so that a farmer can try a practice on a small scale, and it won't cost them a lot if it ends up not working. And then once they build that confidence, they can try it on more acres. An example of some of the incentives we offer are payments per acre for doing soil testing, payments for doing cover crops, and even monetary help doing manure injection calibration. So the peer-to-peer learning that happens at these events is pretty key, and Eric mentioned that, as well as having the opportunity for farmers who have experience and success with these practices to mentor farmers who are just starting.
So the Horse Creek Watershed Council has been operating since around the beginning of 2013, I believe, and we have experienced many things, and there have been a lot of lessons learned, and this is just a small list of a few that we wanted to put together and share with you folks in this presentation. But the first one, engaging the ag community takes time, and just to give you a sense of that, I really credit my predecessors who worked on the priority watershed projects in Horse Creek in the late 90s and early 2000s, because I'm a firm believer that those folks that worked in those watersheds laid a lot of the groundwork for our successes today in these farmer-led initiatives. And I see that from time to time, and I'm very thankful for that. So this is not just a 6 or 8 year project and to see success. I mean, there were years prior to that contributed as well. Relationships based on trust are a must. I mean, anybody working with these groups must provide a dependable service and build relationships on trust. It's imperative. Results from the council's work will not be seen immediately. The council participants need to see incremental progress. So we've, it's always nice to see immediate results, and we found that a lot of the ag producers that we've been involved with like to see results of their work and a sense of accomplishment. And some of the things that we're dealing with, water quality and soil health, take a lot of time to see incremental change. But there are things that we can do to show progress through modeling and some short-term trends with inventories and just an increase in acres from year to year on cover crop planting. I mean, all of those things are important to share, to show progress. Gives the group a sense of accomplishment, and that's a must. Another real important one is this effort is not a one-size-fits-all. All councils are different. They have different resource concerns or different topics that drive them or interest them. So, one thing that works for, say, Horse Creek may not work for the Shell Lake group. And the key is to find what their interests are related to soil health and water quality, and focus on those and expand upon them and kind of develop your programming around what interests them. You certainly don't want to lose their interest, because then you lose participation. Next slide. Moving forward, the Horse Creek Watershed Council plans to continue to offer incentives for priority practices while funding is available. These priority practices include cover crops. We've done manure spreader calibration, soil sampling incentives, nutrient management incentives. We've done buffer strips or field borders. Those are all incentive practices that are offered, and they plan to continue to make those available. They continue to bring new information to their local ag community through field days, workshops, training opportunities, and so forth, and continue to make efforts to mentor other producers in effective conservation practices. And I think every year the group sends out an incentive application form, which describes the incentives that are available for that year. And on every one of those mailings, the contact information of our farmer leaders are on there. And anyone who has questions can reach out to those folks and ask questions or hear about their successes or even failures with these practices. We'll continue to evaluate the effectiveness of cover crops in Northwest Wisconsin. One of the focuses for our group early on was to answer questions surrounding cover crops. There was a lot of questions whether or not cover crops really worked in Northwest Wisconsin with a shortened growing season. And so one of the priorities was to develop a cover crop test plot. And I think this is our 5th or 6th harvest season with a test plot. And we're just beginning to show some pretty valuable data with regards to that test plot. So that too has taken time to show results. Next, to encourage the agriculture community to be engaged in Watershed Council operations. We're always trying to recruit new people and involve people through the incentive program and the workshops that are provided. And this was a fairly new initiative in the last year or two, but our group really hopes to explore groundwater quantity and quality monitoring, and we've been exploring options to do this. And I think that's a very important initiative, because in our area of the state, there isn't a lot of information regarding our groundwater quality or quantity. So if the ag community can be proactive and take the lead on providing some of that information and sharing it with our communities, that would be a wonderful thing. Next slide with Madeline's plans for moving forward.
So the Shell Lake Yellow River Watershed Council, like I mentioned, is really young. So we're still trying to grow and really figure out what we want to focus on, but also to build relationships with our local lake groups. That was something that at least I heard loud and clear from our farmers when we first met, was that they really want to connect with our lake groups and figure out how we can work collaboratively on this issue of protecting our water quality as a whole community. We also want to continue our long-term research plots. Like Eric mentioned, it takes time to really see some of these changes or benefits from some of these practices. We know that they will work, but when do we see those changes, and how can we sort of shorten that curve? Our council is partnering with the Spooner Agricultural Research Station to conduct our research into cover crops and no-till and some of these practices that our council is interested in. We also want to encourage more membership in the council. I think opening up our adding additional watersheds will help as we try to recruit people. and again, explore what practices are going to work in Northwest Wisconsin. It's still a question that our council members are really interested in digging into. And with that, we will take any questions.
Great, thank you, Eric and Madeline. So I would just encourage folks to, again, use that chat feature to ask any questions that you have. Eric did type in that, so hopefully you'll have something showing up on your screen that has the chat bar with some messages in it. So if there's any questions there.
I think at this point it might be nice to have Tim and Bill just touch on some of their experiences too, and any of their reactions to the presentation. Bill and Tim, would you like to add anything before we take questions?
Yeah, and both of them can unmute themselves and chime in.
Okay, well, this is Timm Johnson. First of all, it's been a really interesting experience with the Horse Creek Watershed. My prior experience was with the Squaw Lake Watershed starting back in the early 90s. And the success of that was Buzz Sorge from the DNR was one of those that was in charge of it. And Buzz documented through a mass balance analysis at the beginning and then at the end of the watershed that it went from a net importer of phosphorus to a net exporter of phosphorus. And we saw dramatic changes in some of the practices of the local producers. So we got in the Horse Creek watershed, some of us had prior experience. And we learned, or we know that farmers learn best from their neighbors. We've been really fortunate to have some really well-respected producers in our group that people talk to, and it's a really strong network. We really focused on phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of the three major elements, obviously, that plants need for growth. And usually in water quality, phosphorus is the element that's lacking. So we've tried to focus on reducing the amount of soil loss by harvesting more rainfall and encouraging more infiltration. We do that by improving soil health. The Horse Creek leads into Cedar Lake, which is a eutrophic lake impaired with phosphorus and a 303D impaired waters list. So we've got a great relationship with the Cedar Lake Lake Association, and they're very appreciative of our efforts. As Eric mentioned, we're starting to talk about monitoring groundwater, but also we're also talking about learning about carbon sequestration from the use of cover crops. And in addition to the concept of harvesting rainfall, we're also now going to start learning about the biological web in our soils. The actual knowledge of what's in our soils is rather limited, and we need to learn more about all the organisms that exist in our soil to improve our soil health, to actually increase the infiltration, and that's through use of cover crops and reduced tillage. So, and the bill.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and also thanks, Eric and Madeline, for the presentation. And I'll just, before we open up for questions, I guess just share what inspires me with my involvement through Wisconsin Farmers Union to help coordinate this council, as well as 3 other councils in West Central Wisconsin that Eric mentioned were the pilot programs years ago. But the main thing that inspires me, having come from 15 years working in conservation in nonprofits and from an agency setting, I was with the DNR for 10 years, is just recognizing that a lot of conservation problems that we're trying to solve, whether they're water quality or what have you, they're rooted in behavior change, and having people change practices of what they're doing on the landscape. And that's not an easy thing for anybody who's tried to lose weight or quit smoking. It's hard to change what you do, and it's hard to break a habit. And so what inspires me with working with people like Tim and other farmers is that these councils offer us an opportunity to create social support around helping other farmers to change the way they farm. So whether that's by creating learning opportunities where farmers are sharing knowledge with each other, or in some ways creating, I guess you would say, peer pressure within a particular neighborhood where other farmers see their neighbors changing and hear the conversations about why that's important. So I'm really inspired by the farmers and the county staff like Eric who we're working with and the relationships we're building, and watching how the incremental change year after year, like Eric said, it's not a silver bullet right away, but heard some farmers mention that, you know, looking back after 5 years of what after these councils have been established, seeing different practices in the fields of farmers who 5 years ago thought they'd never see that kind of change. So that's what inspires me, and I'm really happy to be a part of this and happy to answer questions.
Hey, Bill, this is Eric Olson. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks again to Tim and Eric as well, and Madeline. My question, I guess, is about sort of the thinking statewide and to some of the other issues we see between sort of farmers and producers and lakeshore folks. Sometimes things can get into maybe like a finger pointing situation where nobody's really sure exactly where the water quality comes from, but everyone seems to be sure that it's someone else. And so broadly, people say, well, so shoreline property owners, you know, if they could just stop fertilizing their yards, stop cutting down all the trees, maybe then the water quality would get better. Do you see any evidence of that kind of thing in Northwest Wisconsin with these groups? Or, you know, how do farmers characterize shoreline property owners, I guess, is a generic way to say it. And do you see evidence that the shoreline property owners are stepping up and doing more to protect water quality as well?
Well, Eric, I can touch on that a little bit here, because we've had over the years some experiences in that, and I would say that there are some barriers, but through transparency and partnerships, those barriers can be broken down. And there were a few projects that I was lucky enough to be involved in here in Polk County and in Horse Creek that were helpful in breaking down some of those barriers and hopefully creating some partnerships between the ag community and the lake districts or lake associations. And one of those projects was a soil test watershed assessment, and we performed by request some soil testing throughout the agricultural lands in Horse Creek, and we wanted to do an evaluation of where the soil test phosphorus was on the ag fields, just to get a snapshot of what the levels were. But that came, when we presented that to the ag community, it came with a caveat, was that the lakeshore owners did that as well. And so what was really great about it is we were able to take soil tests on lakeshore property owners that had volunteered to offer up their property to have samples taken, and then compare the results. And I think it was really eye-opening for both groups that the average soil test levels in the entire watershed of Horse Creek were lower than the lakeshore property owner average. The lakeshore soil tests were very similar to an area around Horse Creek that I would call the main drainage to Horse Creek. Obviously, those areas are lower on the landscape, but the point was that they shared this information. They worked together. We're all around the same table, communicating and planning this project, and ultimately the transparency of information back and forth broke down some barriers, and there was a conversation that was had around something that they wouldn't normally have been brought together to talk on. So I'm seeing initiatives like the Horse Creek Watershed Council and all Watershed Council efforts work collectively with lake districts and lake groups to work towards addressing common goals. And I think that is one of the great positive impacts of this sort of program. And I am very hopeful that it continues.
Thanks, Eric. We've got a question from Bruce. He's wondering if there's a place for cranberry operations in your efforts.
Boy, absolutely. I would think so, although and there may be some cranberry operators involved in watershed councils in the state at this point, but I'm not aware of any. But certainly they could, if there's a network of cranberry operators that are working together, I would think that they would be able to apply for a producer-led watershed protection grant application, just like our other agricultural producers.
So best as you know, or maybe anyone else, Tim or Madeline, these watersheds that we're talking about today don't have much of a cranberry presence. Would that be accurate?
I would say that's accurate at this point.
Yeah, I can't speak for sure that there aren't cranberry growers in our watershed. I think it's possible, but like I said, we're still very new, so I think it would be worth reaching out to cranberry growers in our area if they are in our watershed.
Sure, and I think there's some cranberry operations in northern Washburn County, southern Douglas County, over in Sawyer County as well. And these programs that we're talking about, those producers need to kind of start talking to each other and start talking to their county and seeing if they want to engage in these types of projects, right? I mean, DATCAP is essentially creating a platform and some funding to get these types of things started.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, and I would just add that with Shell Lake Yellow Rivers Council, we have it's a big asset in my mind, but it's also kind of a unique challenge as we get started, is that we have producers who, like our crop and dairy guys, have a lot of acres. They're kind of a big time operation. And then some of our grass-fed cattle and bison people are a smaller operation. So trying to see where that common ground is, and beyond just soil health and trying to do cover crops, it looks very different in a grazing setting than in a crop setting. So trying to find those commonalities is something we're still working on. And I think that would be a similar thing with cranberry growers. What's that common ground? Obviously that's the soil, but how do we look at practices and see how that works for your operation?
Eric here. I see Marcia has a question. Do watershed councils tabulate phosphorus pounds reduced compared to what's needed for the TMDL? And I'll touch on this a little bit because our Horse Creek watershed has been tracking phosphorus reductions throughout our effort. And we do this for cover crops and no-till, some of the more common practices, and the conservation practices that we're able to plug into a spreadsheet called STEP-L, the spreadsheet tool for estimating pollutant loads. And we enter this information into STEP-L and it gives us a reduction based on the number of acres of each practice we have. So we are tracking this and we are reporting it. And, it's a little bit out of our space, but we assume that when we report on this information, it is with some agency being compared to what's needed for the TMDL and you know, tracked at the state level for the TMDL. So we are calculating it and providing it to those that that should be accounting for it with regards to the TMDL. I'm hopeful that answers your question. And I think others are doing that as well. I will also mention that not every council is doing it the same way we are. Some are using other programs such as SNAP Plus, but we find Step L to be helpful. And yes, we report mainly to DADCAP. And I do know that DNR does get those reports as well.
Great, thanks, Eric. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has anything to add for that topic. Sounds good. I've got another question. How effective has this initiative been in increasing producer involvement in soil and water conservation efforts?
Who would like to take that one?
Well, Eric, why don't you answer that, because you've been documenting the increase of cover crops and
Sure.
nutrient management plans, et cetera, over the last 6-7 years.
Sure. Yeah, so it has been effective. You know, we have 3 categories of producers. I feel anyway. We have the early adopters, we have the middle adopters, and then we have the group that I'll call the never adopters. And you know, we kind of categorize our ag community in those from a conservation standpoint, and we have been fairly successful in attracting a fair amount of middle adopters with our incentive program. And you know, we have to make a list of conservation practices that are appealing, that are somewhat low overhead to implement, like cover crops, and we've been fairly successful in adding a few new producers each year with those efforts, and we have seen an increase in conservation practices from no-till to cover crops since we started. So I think we've been fairly effective. It is somewhat plateaued here in recent years, and I don't have a good sense of why that is. If we've reached all of the egg producers in our operating area, or it very well could be that we've reached everyone that is interested in incentives, but we're still evaluating that. And one I guess challenge that we've seen is recruiting active farmer leaders for the council itself. And we've had a very active group of 6 or 7 ag producers, and we certainly don't want to burn those folks out, but they have been very dedicated and active since the beginning. And we've added 1 new member in the years we've been operating, and maybe lost another one along the way. But we've always found it challenging to recruit new members for some turnover, or to give some relief for those super volunteers that we've had along the way. So there's still more work to be done on this, and we're evaluating it. But so far, I think we've been pretty successful in maintaining and slowly increasing producer involvement.
This is Tim. I would just like to add a couple of success stories. One of our council members talked to a fellow producer that he knows. This farm this farmer and his dad were basically stuck back in the 1950s. And the father was adamantly against any kind of conservation practices or even soil testing. And this last year, because there were incentives, they actually did some soil testing. We have seen producers that I'd never imagined would actually use cover crops. Next door neighbors have gone to no-till instead of the heavy mechanization of tillage. And they actually did some planting into standing rye this spring with soybeans. We had another producer who, surprising to me, actually had cereal rye flown into 300 acres of standing corn a couple of years ago by a helicopter or by an airplane. So producers are trying things, and it's simply by respecting what other people are doing, and they're learning from their fellow producers.
One additional thing I'd like to add, and I didn't touch on the influence outside of our watershed boundary in increasing producer involvement. I think we may have reached a plateau with the active participants within our operating area, but throughout our county, we have seen the Watershed Council's influence firsthand. Our county is, in the last couple of years, has never been greener in the fall with all the cover crops that have been planted throughout our county. And I'm happy to say that those producers that are planting those cover crops, I know, have attended one or two of the field day events that the Horse Creek Watershed Council has put on. So, you know, that's positive as well.
I would also just add, if you want a statewide perspective, that the Department of Ag does put out an annual report for what the impacts are from their grant applications. And there are obviously even councils or groups of farmers that aren't currently funded that are doing some of this good work as well.
This is Eric again in Stevens Point. Quick question. I know some farmers are looking at sort of things like agroforestry or permanent living cover, things like nut crops and alternatives to having to go out and work on the soil so much. And I know the seasons are short up there and the conditions are not great, but what sort of kind of on the edge type of practices might people be thinking about and experimenting with? Are you aware of anybody doing sort of kind of interesting and creative work with their land?
I think the closest thing to that we've been experimenting with here in Polk County is Kernza and intermediate wheatgrass. You know, we had some of our Horse Creek watershed producers experiment with that. We received some seed some time ago from the Land Institute to try, and it was before the markets really ramped up for Kernza. But you know, we had a few field days on the demonstration plot that was planted, and I like to think we contributed to the effort. We don't currently have anyone continuing work with Kernza within our watershed group, but there's certainly an open invitation to do so. And I think right now the markets and the processing and cleaning facilities, some of that infrastructure is better now than when we actually had some planted. So I think that's really the closest thing to your question, Eric.
Eric, I would also add, in some of the other councils that I work with, there's been use of precision agriculture technology that farmers have been using to identify the places on their fields where the costs of the inputs of planting and spraying a certain area of the field is greater than the return that they're getting from those areas of the field. And that's been really helpful for farmers to identify places where it makes sense just to take those out of production and replace it with a perennial pollinator plot or some other type of cover. So that's been some movement in other councils that I've worked with.
Yeah, and Kevin Shesso from the UW-Madison Division of Extension mentioned that the Spooner Ag Station does have a demo research plot of Kernza going. I think they also have a couple of other demo areas that might be relevant too, that most people probably drive by there on Highway 70 and they don't even notice exactly what's going on, but there's a lot of learning opportunities right there as far as how to do what Bill just mentioned. There are federal and state programs that are designed to increase habitat on lands that are probably marginal. I think the Ag Station has taken advantage of some of those, and there's some neat plantings that you kind of probably zoom by at like 60 miles an hour, but you never notice that that's what's going on right there. And Caitlin put in the chat a link to the DACCAP producer-led watershed annual reports. So if you go into the chat, you can click right on that. And we're coming up on 11:30, so I guess I'd look for any last minute questions in the chat too. Oh, here's one. If you don't mind me asking this, Caitlin. Are you aware of any outreach to custom manure haulers to provide equipment for low disturbance injection? So a way to get the manure into the soil faster. Is anybody doing that in terms of practices in your neck of the woods?
Well, I do know of a couple of larger producers in Polk County that are doing low disturbance injection, and it would be one of those things to add to the list of demonstration field days, because I know that they're incorporating that manure into fields with cover crops as well. So that would be a good field day topic.
And I would add that that's something our council is already talking about, is how do we work with our local custom manure haulers to either try some of this, do research around it, or do a field day.
Great, and then I saw that Kevin added to the chat, this is going back to the Spooner Ag Station demo, but they also have organic soybeans direct seeded into cereal rye cover crops. Rye is then terminated with roller crimper. And then adding that Yellow River has had this discussion on low disturbance manure applications as well.
Yeah, so Kevin's actually one of our educator partners for our council as well. So it's great to see that he's on and can provide some of his experience being at the Spooner Ag Station.
It's such a great opportunity to have that ag research station in your backyard, Madeline. And thanks, Kevin and Phil, for all the work up there.
Yeah, we feel very fortunate to have that partnership with the Ag Station.
Great. So it looks like we have about 2 minutes left. I don't know if anyone on the panel had any last minute things they really wanted to share today.
Boy, Eric here, I just want to thank everybody for putting this together in this format, because this is, I think, worked really well and was great. So thanks to Eric Olson and Caitlin and all the others that put this together.
Yes, and I will just second that.
I will third it.
Well, then I'm going to follow up and thank you all, Tim, Bill, Eric, and Madeline, for your time and for being with us this morning still, I guess almost afternoon, but this has been really great. So I guess I'll just throw out there that we are hopefully going to be sending up a follow-up survey, so that if there are things that everyone wanted to share, look for that in your email, and we would love it if you'd fill that survey back in and give us feedback for next year's conference. And there should be a place on here if you want to thank the presenters where you do the reaction. So if you want to clap or share things in the comment to thank those folks, that's more than welcome. And then I did also just want to make sure to thank all of our sponsors. So we've got a number of folks that sponsored this conference. You should have seen those on that intro slide. That was part of the keynote, but we really couldn't do this without those sponsors. I think the sponsors, the presenters really do, and then everyone who attends really do make this a success. And there we've got all of our partners and sponsors. So the partners are the folks who are on the planning committee. And then the sponsors are mostly down there on the bottom with their logos. And then the little bit of housekeeping, just the same way that you got on to this talk, you're able to access the next talk. We do have a little bit of a break. It's longer because it's a lunch break from 11:30 to 12:15. And if you kind of stay in this stream one, our next presentation here will be the Deer Lake Management Story, Something for Everyone.
Yep. So I'll just mention you can leave this meeting and come back. You'll always be able to use the links on the web page that you use to get into here. So you don't have to keep this meeting open. You can go away, have your lunch, and then come back just by clicking on that link, and we'll be here ready to start the next presentations. As Caitlin mentioned, those start at 12:15. So enjoy whatever weather you may have in your part of the state or the region, and we'll see you back in this stream at 12:15.